So the topic for today's webinar is driving value from GDPR compliance. So the idea of the webinar is not to focus so much on what GDPR is or why you need to comply. That's fairly well understood by now. But also looking at how you can leverage the need for compliance to put your data in order, so to speak, and actually gain some value from this, this requirement to comply. So, of course, we'll start with a disclaimer. This is not a recommendation necessarily. It's some advice and some entry points. And it's a set of discussion points that you can have within your organization or with your advisors in terms of what works best for you for GDPR compliance. Okay, so no GDPR presentation is complete without banding out of a deadline, so 25th of May 2018. And then what the fuss about really is, what it boils down to, is you need to more effectively manage data, and in particular very personal private data. And it's not just, a lot of people think of customers, it's actually employees, contacts for your suppliers, for your customers if you're B2B as well, and any relevant person that you might hold information on. So that's what it is, and that's why Informatica is interested in this, because at the heart of this is about data management and data governance and good data governance. And that is what GDPR is trying to achieve in terms of responsibilities. So a quick look at the timeline, but working backwards from the May 25th. The GDPR was actually adopted in 2016, but to be honest, no one did much for 2016. And kind of towards the back end of 2017, there's a lot of waking up, understanding what a big deal this is for those organizations who had not yet started the data governance or data management journey, and a lot of getting internal advice. Once that advice has been gathered, internal, external advice has been gathered, the compliance strategy will be defined. And that really depends on current state of the organization and also the risk averseness or of the organization. You know, how much risk do they want to take on board, and do they think they are at risk in terms of an attack for data or an inquiry from a regulator or an individual. Once a compliance strategy has been defined, then you can work through a couple of processes, very typical processes in a project: gap analysis, how far are we away from being where we want to be, prioritization of activities, and then looking at, once you've got the prioritization, actually start taking some actions on your first priorities. And that could be technology installation, it could be processes, it could be education of your organization. And then the next big deadline in the big blue circle is next May. But it's interesting because it's enforceable. It's not like you have to submit something at that date. Actually, for most of us, the world will not change. They won't be doing anything different on that particular day. But the effects will be more long-term and come on after that in terms of the, how we have to manage data. And therefore, there's a lot of ability and capability for people to look at priority 2 and beyond activities to come in after May 2018. So the way we see this is a lot of people are getting ready for a certain amount of priority 1 criteria for May next year, but they've got a long-term program of how they can get, closer towards where they want to be in terms of data governance and data management. And so, just to make this a little bit more interactive, the first poll of the day, we're going to have 3 polls during the day. So poll questions should pop up. So if you would like to respond, it's curious to me, where are you, your GDPR compliance journey? Are you at the first with a middle big blue circle of defining a strategy? Or are you closer to gap analysis and defining priorities? Perhaps you have a priority 1 project underway, or you've actually even completed your priority 1 project, which would be great news, actually. So, we're not getting a very sharing audience there, so we didn't actually get any responses from that, I don't think, but never mind. Oh wait, we did. Okay, great. Couple of people right at the beginning, defining compliance strategy and gap analysis, defining priorities, is where the audience is about today. But now, interestingly enough, a lot of the people we speak to are kind of on the prioritization of activities and starting the priority 1 activities. For those of you who, right at the beginning, in terms of defining compliance strategy and gap analysis, I wouldn't worry too much. Not many people have gone that far ahead with actually implementing the priority 1 activities. That's scheduled for the upcoming months. And what we'll see today is there's actually quite a few things that you can do within the relatively short period of time just to start you on your journey. Okay, so the first thing, it's 6 months away, so you need to get practical. But on the other hand, you can't ignore the potential for value. And the potential for value is coming from stemming from the fact that for once data governance, which has been long neglected, actually has board level support, because the legal department's saying that, and it's being budgeted. People saying, well, we have to comply to GDPR, we have to manage our data. So this is possibly a once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform the way an organization manages data, to say, right, this is how it should be, because actually what GDPR is doing is it's capturing some very good principles of responsible data management, which we all should be doing anyway, but we haven't done because our organizations haven't grown up that way. So it's really an opportunity to deliver trusted data management and privacy as a differentiator. And I think as we go on further down the line, when people are comfortable with GDPR, actually they'll be expecting some level of data privacy management and some level of interaction with companies they share data with. And the benefits of compliance are obviously avoiding fines, reputational damage. No one wants reputational damage in terms of being hauled over the press for non-compliance of some facet or a data leak or anything like that. But I think another key thing, it comes back to this data governance, data management, having board level approval, board level support, is it actually supports the digital transformation outcomes. And I think that deserves a little bit more attention. So I'll just go into that quickly. What do we mean by digital transformation outcomes? So depending on the industry you're in or where you are, you will either have been completely shaken up by digital transformation. That's typically the service industry, travel agencies, hotels, taxi companies, retail, or you're on the verge of being shaken up by digital transformation, where even in consumer goods, people are pairing technology with physical products to try and reach out to consumers and to engage more with the consumers. And a lot of heavy equipment manufacturers as well, for example, are switching from selling products to actually more of a service-oriented model, getting information back from their products. So a lot of services are becoming digital, which means that you need to manage your data differently in order to win in this digital world. And if we look back, why we're all in a bother right now about having to redo our management of data is initially data was used for very specific business applications. It was either paper-based or was trapped in a system that dealt with one particular business process, and that was it. And there was never any thought of data moving out of that. Then what Informatica sees as data 2.0 is a bit of a maturity from that, saying, well, actually, data should be used across business processes. So that's roughly aligned with the rise of ERP systems and data warehousing, where people are saying, well, we want to use data out of this business process and so forth. But data was still fundamentally owned by a business process or by a business division. They just shared it a little bit when we were asked to, if they were asked to. And there was no, although data was available in a data warehouse, not every organization really made an effort to manage that data properly. It was just there. And now what we're seeing in data 3.0 is data is becoming the fundamental driver of digital transformation. That means without management, collection and management and usage of your data and ensuring it's of a high data quality, you will probably fall behind as your competitors and partners transform to use more and more digital processes to bring more and more digital services and products to market. And that is fundamentally why GDPR exists today, is that the European Commission and a lot of European citizens have seen the progress in how people are using data. We all read in the press about people, how much data people are gathering about us and what they're using to it, and we can see the effects in terms of marketing. And this is just going to increase as organizations get more data hungry. And so this is an effort to put the people back in control of their data to understand how data is being used in the future of the digital transformation. So you can't really take GDPR away from digital transformation. The two are fundamentally linked. But so where do we go from here? So still 6 months to go. We'd like to extract value from data. We would like to power digital transformations, but we still got this deadline hanging over our heads. So what Informatica sees is, because everyone's at a different place, every organization is at a different place, they've got a different maturity in data management, they have different priorities. It's actually to look to entry points in your requirements and your business. So how can you start this journey and understand the upside of all these entry points, which will help you decide what to prioritize. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the fact that this is fundamentally a data problem, a personal data problem, and you can break it down. And we've identified 4 entry points, which can be understood by some simple questions. So right at the top, a very basic question: do you know what data you hold? Who has access to this data? And what purposes do you use it for? And if you're in a small organization, you could probably answer those questions fairly readily. But the larger the organization gets, that becomes more challenging, especially if you've grown by acquisition. Somewhat related to that question on the left-hand side is, do you know where all your in-scope data is? So if you're knowing what data you hold, but where is this kept? And that's also, again, it's a challenging question because data tends to move. It's no longer static. It doesn't reside in the system it was created in and maybe moved to a data warehouse. There's constantly people pulling new reports, spinning up new apps, trying new things as we all adapt to our new digital world. So data moves. And the data has a lineage, and you need to understand where it's coming from and going to. How do you know, in the middle block, another question or entry point is, do you know how you'll manage consents and data rights? So consents are becoming a lot more granular. And they need to be proactive as well. You can't say, well, I think they consented because they didn't object. It has to be very, very specific, explicit consent to do something. And of course, the GDPR gives individual citizens lots of rights about asking questions about the data, actually asking for the data, and the right to be forgotten as well. And the final entry point is, do you know how you will protect your data and ensure it has appropriate control? So that's looking at the last line of defense is protecting the data. Is it masked? Is the authority, the authorization correct that people accessing the data are authorized to access that data? So those are the entry points. Now, again, this is not prescriptive. You should start with 1 and go to 2, 3, or 4. It really depends on your organization and how you feel you're going to approach compliance. Again, GDPR is a principles-based compliance. You need to understand which principles are most important to you. So, second poll question. Out of those 4 entry points, where do you see your highest priority in the next 6 months or so? So the first one is documentation and data governance. What data do we hold? Who has access to it? Why do we have access to it? The PII, personally identifiable data, finding out where that is in the organization. Or choice C, looking at consents and data subject rights. Or data protection. Now, of course, these are the entry points that Informatica have identified. So you could actually say E, other, that you have other priorities for next year. Right, so while we're waiting for people to record the answers to that, I'll have a bit of a spoiler in the next slide. These are the 2 entry points that I have been seeing as the most popular over the last few months. And it makes sense in a way why these are the most popular entry points, because these are popular for organizations that haven't started the data governance journey. They really need to get their arms around what data they have and need to understand where it is. So it's looking like that from the responses that we've got here in terms of responses, the top one's proving popular. And then the second most popular one will be data protection and control, personal data protection and control. So somewhat in a line to what we've seen generally over the last few months. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into these 2 in a little bit more detail. The first one is asking, knowing what data that you hold and so forth. We see that as a data governance problem. And the data governance, you really need to understand what data you have and how you're aligning to the principles. And you can begin your documentation journey. So GDPR has some aspects in there that require you to document the data that you're using and showing that you actually understand what it's using for. Now, initially, what people would be doing with this is they're saying, right, and I've seen some horrendous looking Word documents and spreadsheets. Can you please just fill in this Word document / spreadsheet for your system? Or IT will go around and interview system owners and they'll have a task force. But the problem with that is you get a very static document, so it doesn't update as your very dynamic IT environment updates. It's mostly done manually, so it could be actually inaccurate as well. And it gets out of date very quickly. So Informatica sees that technology can help here, and in particular data governance technologies such as Informatica Axon, which gives you a framework which is very friendly towards the business user and really designed for the business user to help the organization as a whole to collaboratively define definition of policies, data governance policies, how we're going to manage this data, and also describe the data that you have in the organization, which you can then publish to the entire organization and actually link it to particular artifacts and data. And there's huge value of this beyond faster compliance reporting is actually it speeds up anything in your organization that requires data as a foundation, like data science, like reporting, and so forth. And it also gives you a better idea of your risk that your data has is posing in terms of exposure to personal information. And finally, it drives this huge transition that all organizations are going to go through to treat data as an asset that can power the future, I would say, digital transformation, but the business process in the future as we are all running in a more and more digital world. The second most popular entry point is sensitive data discovery and analysis, and that makes a lot of sense as well. If you have multiple systems, most people will know the top couple of systems that have personal information in it because they'll be easily identifiable. There'll be something obvious like a customer database or a CRM system. But beyond that, it gets a bit fuzzy because there's a bit of subjectiveness. People say, well, my system's more important. How much data is actually being held in there, that drives some things. And it's really hard to say, okay, well, let's prioritize a list to have some sort of conference and find this information based on based on facts versus subjectiveness and so forth. And again, the questionnaire comes here is another common approach, which has exactly the same drawbacks as the previous approach is. Anytime you're looking at IT systems, which constantly change, it's time-consuming, it's resource-consuming, it's inaccurate and out of date. And again, technology can help, and what Informatica sees here is a technology like Secure at Source, which is actually, you can think of as a crawler that can goes out to your system and goes and finds the data that's being stored in the system according to your guidance. So you could set it up for some high-level GDPR requirements, where it will go out and will identify, well, is this personal information? Does it look like a name? Does it look like some sort of social security number? Does it look like a telephone? And also do some smarter things for saying, well, actually a telephone number just by itself might not be personal information, but a telephone number combined with a social security number, first name and last name, is personal data. And there's a certain amount of risk associated with the number of records as well. So you might have very, very detailed records about an individual, but you've only got 200 records in that system, which would probably be a lower risk than another system which has somewhat less detailed records, but still personally identified, but it has 2 or 3 million records in the system. So again, the number of records in the system also is telling in terms of what the priorities are for securing the data and the risk of that system. It also helps you understand where data is coming from and going to. So if you can secure it literally at the source, then all the copying in terms of data masking and all the copying of the data, you wouldn't have to secure it so much down the line. So the benefits of this, of course, is faster data discovery, not only for GDPR, but for other policies. You might have other policies that you want to manage your data by in terms of how long you keep it for, who has access to it, and so forth. And also not only does this find what personal data you have as well, but it actually uses artificial intelligence to monitor the usage pattern of that data and look for unusual usage patterns which could be a sign of something going wrong. Okay, so those are the top 2 entry points in terms of popularity. That doesn't mean the other entry points are not important. So I'm going to go through them quite quickly, together. Just to go into a little bit more detail and give the reasons why I see these coming lower down on the priority list. So they are lower priority in short term, they're high value in the long term. I think they're lower priority in short term, especially for those organizations that are starting. It makes sense. Why would you worry about consent or data protection in particular if you don't actually know where your data is? But this is really high value in the long term, in particular the managing consents and data rights. So one of the reasons for lower priority is many organizations already have consents. Now, they're not necessarily the best consents in terms of GDPR, and they're also managed within a system. And the thinking is, well, we've got something in place for this. We'll start with somewhere else where we're less well protected, or we're less well covered. So that's why consents tend to go down the list. And also there's a doubt in people's minds as to, well, yes, people have these data rights, but if they look in the organizations, they say, well, very few people actually even ask us today about how we use the data. So we don't see that being a big problem. If 10 people ask us per month or per year, we'll probably make a plan, but that's absolutely fine. But on the other hand, there's a huge value of actually looking at these as a starting point for master data management, because master data management, especially in the customer domain, has shown business value in terms of being better able to understand, better able to target, better able to respond to customers and give them the experience, the personalized experience that they are now coming to expect from organizations. So anything that requires you to get a central view, and consents are very, you manage them a very central view, getting a central view of the data of individuals, so that if they do enact the data right, you can respond very quickly in the time that you required. That really helps you in customer centricity programs, which are proven to deliver value, and any digital transformation programs where you want to gather information in via devices or interactions on the internet on particular people. And again, it's not just customers in this respect. Employees is another big consent and rights area where people are looking into. And the final entry point is, how do you protect your data and ensure it has appropriate controls? Now, there are two buckets, I say, of reasons why this is a lower priority, one good and one not so good. The not so good one is a lot of people thinking, well, you know, the type of organization I am, we're not really a target, so we'll get to this later. I think that's maybe a little bit naive. I think everyone's a target in terms of data these days. You probably lower down the target list. So that's not such a great one, but I can understand the other reasoning on the slide is, well, actually we need to know where our sensitive data is before we can make any sensible decisions, and understand our risk before we can make sensible decisions about how to protect that data. And in this case, in particular, we're talking about data masking and archiving. And data masking can be dynamic data masking, which means that if a certain authority, I can see the records. I might be in invoicing, so I can see all the financial invoices of the customer. But someone in marketing might not be able to see that information. Or they might be able to see the invoice, but they might not be able to see who the customer is in particular, just for marketing analysis. So dynamic data masking or permanent data masking, which is a little bit closer aligned to data archiving, is permanently masking the record and making it non-personally identifiable anymore. And another great way to comply to GDPR, it's quite simply archive the data that you're not using as well. So it's hard to manage data if you've got a lot of it. It's an overhead to manage data you're never using or have no purpose to, or not processing, or not delivering value, so there's no reason why you can't archive that off. Oh, well, there are some legal requirements that you need to keep that, but apart from that. So the business value of this protection, the masking and the archiving, is faster and more secure application testing through dynamic data masking, and of course reducing costs through data minimization. So that's the 4 entry points that Informatica sees. Each one of them is associated with something you can accelerate with technology. But what the interesting part about that is if you put some technology in, that it should not be specific for GDPR. It should have the bigger picture in mind. It should have, go back to the fundamentals of why are we doing GDPR? We're doing GDPR because we need to be better stewards of the personal data we keep. And that can be extended actually for competitive advantage in the future. We need to be better stewards of all our data. In order for us to understand what data we're keeping in the organization and treat that data as an asset and leverage that data in our digital world. And so that's the real potential for value, is these GDPR capabilities that we're all required to put in place, use them to build a platform for other requirements. So this is a question for the audience. Is this, when you view GDPR, what strategy are you taking? The first one is, and there's no right and wrong answer here. Some people are just focused on the regulation for whatever reason, say, well, that's actually what we want to achieve, and therefore we'll achieve the regulation. There are others, however, who have been trying to get data governance or master data management projects or anything that makes them dynamic about their data in terms of finding the data that they need for reporting and so forth. So there's a lot of people there that's saying, well, actually, we really want to take this GDPR budget and build a foundation. Then you get the people who are, yeah, we should, but we don't have the right support in the organization right now, so they're just going to get across the lines. And then for those lucky few people, and there are some there that are quite advanced in the data governance journey, they think, well, actually, we're not going to bring a major change in the data management capabilities and processes. So interestingly enough, in the poll questions here, the focus of this audience seems to be very much on the regulation, which, again, according, if you look at the timelines, that does make a lot of sense. But I would encourage you to go at least into the bucket C and say, yes, we should look at that. What we put in place now for GDPR should, at the very least, not restrict us to only compliance, but enable us to expand that in the future. Okay, so just a quick summary of the compliance efforts, how Informatica can support through data governance, through sensitive data discovery, risk analysis, consent masking, enacting rights, and finally data archiving and anonymization. I'm now going to open it up to questions using the Q&A or the chat function. I'll give you a minute or so to answer your questions, and well, not a minute's a bit long. I'll give you a few seconds to answer your questions, but please feel free to ask any questions on the content that's been presented today, or other questions that you have on GDPR, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, there's one question that's come in here. It's on the value of data governance. And I think data governance is a little bit misunderstood. The question that is coming in is, can you expand a little bit more on what value you could get by implementing data governance? So I think if we look at, we need to look at that in context. What do we mean in this context by data governance? It's really getting a control of your data, cataloging your data and defining it. This, this is a customer name. This is what we expect in this field. This is the quality of the field in that particular system. So really sharing and contributing, not just one person going around and document data, but actually involving the business users who use all the systems to accurately describe the data in a system, and also who's in charge, who are the data stewards, and take control and responsibility for a particular data field, which will help you work on the data quality and so forth. And in terms of value, there's two big buckets of value that we see coming in. One of them is in time. So we've had an international bank who implemented data governance, and they said, well, plus minus 20 to 30% of anyone who creates reports, their time is taken up by looking for data, understanding data, is that the right data source? And that's exactly what data governance will address, is that amount of time that you find, is this the right data for the purpose I'm needing it? An oil and gas company said, well, actually 80% of the data scientists' time is spent on looking for data and understanding data to do their more advanced analysis. So I think it makes sense. Data scientists tend to have a broader reach and tend to go out of necessary comfort zones to try and find the data, so they would probably spend more time looking for data than report people, which probably more typically looking at within an within a business process area to create a new report. But either way, if you take large, the large international bank, they said, well, they did all the calculations and say, well, if we've got 1,000 people or so creating reports, that comes out to 15 million euros per year, an opportunity that those people could do something else with that time if they could just find their data quicker. So that's one, is the value of the time you get back. And the second one is an interesting one, is application rationalization. That once you start documenting the data that you use and you understand, the data that you don't use becomes more obvious. Well, why is that data there? And I think a lot of companies will have that. They would have spun up a data mart a couple of years ago. You put the data in there, you use it for something, and then it becomes defunct or people move on or something. But the data mart remains because no one knows who else is using it and so forth. So there's another bank that looked at their applications that they're using through data governance, saying, well, hang on a minute, it's highlighting a couple of applications that aren't being using, and they saw that they could probably take about €1 billion out of their systems, just by, or out of their budget, but just by application rationalization. So obviously you need to have a fairly large IT budget if you can save $1 billion by application rationalization, but you can see that the money adds up just if you understand your data better. Now, for those of you outside banking, I think there's a reason why these examples are coming from banking, is because it's such a highly regulated industry. They have had to implement data governance before GDPR for other regulations that they've had. And so out of all the industries, they're leading in terms of data governance. So it makes sense that the first ones to see value. That doesn't mean that they're the only industry. I think every industry will see value from better data governance.
Monica, we've got, oh, do you see those questions that have come through?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, I've got a couple of questions. Now, these questions are data archive, employee leaves, what right does the ex-employee have that data removed? I'm not a lawyer. I don't believe, and the second question as well, unfortunately, I'm not a lawyer in terms of, do we still need to consent? I think in general, yes, I would imagine that every data subject has rights to the data, But archiving is an interesting question that's often debated. Well, is it, once it's archived, how have you archived it? Is it still personally identifiable? So you need to look at how you're archiving your data and consult with your legal team on that one. And if you have business contact data rather than personal, I would go, now, everyone's focused on consent. So I'm not going to answer that question directly. The question is, if we have business contact data on a database for marketing purposes rather than individuals, do we still need to get consent to keep them on the database? I think, again, you look at your legal team, but a lot of people are looking at consent, and consent is not the only reason that you can keep information. So you could say that there's justified use as well. Do you need that? And you could look at saying, well, maybe I don't, for my business contacts with work addresses where actually I'm interested in a role and that role's populated at this time by a particular person, Joe Blogs, and it might be Jane Blogs in a year's time. You could say, well, actually, I'm keeping that information in order to have good business relationships. And I think a lot of the supplier and B2B customer information with work addresses will probably be justified more on the reasonable right of processing rather than consent. So I'd say look at how you're going to justify the usage of that data. See if consent is the only relevant justification of that use, and then make some calls on that. Because you can get around it. Well, you can justify keeping data and using data for other reasons, and that makes sense. You know, especially your suppliers, you always have to keep your supplier data and your customer data online. So if someone doesn't pay, or you need to pay someone with a query, that you can get hold of them. So again, those two questions about how you're going to enact that, I suggest that you take your internal legal advice.
Yeah, just on that one, Monica, Softcat have run webinars with a consultancy called CyberCrowd, so I will share that recording with everyone who's attended right now, and that provides kind of an introduction to the regulation and addresses a lot of the questions around kind of consent and opt-ins. So I'll send that around to everyone.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so I'll take, there's one more question that I'll take, it's around consent, and, well, not consent, in rights enactment, is do you see a large uptick in people coming in requesting, you know, what is they're entitled to request in terms of their rights? How are you using my data? What data do you have by me? Please, can I port my data, and so forth. And many organizations don't see a large uptick in this, and that's why people are doing consent management, or no, sorry, rights enactment a little bit later down the line. They go further down the line because they're thinking, you know what, hardly anyone calls now, and even if it, you know, increases tenfold a year or 100-fold a year, we could probably still do it manually. And I think that's going to be a very interesting one. And I think there's not going to be a large uptick. I don't think May next year there's going to be a whack of people coming in and asking organizations for data. But I think it is going to increase, and the reason why I do think it's going to increase, I did a lot of research into this, and if you look at social media platforms, which is not exactly the same as, you know, GDPR, but it is to some extent, as social media platforms like Facebook roll out privacy controls, people tend to take them up. They tend to use them. So it's a matter of, at the moment, no one's got any rights in terms of data, and organizations in terms of asking what data you've got, and please forget me, and please can you give me my data. So it makes sense that no one's actually asking for, you know, there's very little context about that. But as people get more comfortable with the fact that they can control their data, I think that it is going to pick up quite a bit. So it'll probably be a slow growth. And one thing to watch out for, which again is a big unknown, but depending on the type of organization you are, it could be a form of protest, or it could be a third party looking to act as a broker to gather data on behalf of other people. So you could see, you know, groups of people coming together for various reasons and saying, right, I'd like my data, please. Can you tell me how you're using my data, and so forth. That I think is unlikely, but it's like a denial of service attack. How do you just swamp someone out of protest to slow them down? But I think the reality is that as people get more comfortable with their rights and understanding how organizations use data, they will try and enact those rights. It'll be a growth over time, not a big rush in May next year. Another question's coming in on the recommendation format. I have not in terms of data migration, I haven't seen any requirements about what the format is. It's just a right to port the data, and I think that's going to be a developed thing over time. And again, this comes down to your own personal choice to some extent. Is depending on how what purpose people are asking for porting their data, and what type of data you have on them, that will determine the format. Because if I'm an employee and I want all my data from my company, there's going to be some very structured data in terms of the personal data they have on me, my salary records, the insurances I've signed up for in terms of pensions and health insurance and so forth. That'll be very structured data. They might also be keeping other data on me in terms of performance reviews and so forth, which would be less structured. It could be in a system. The older ones, could be in a Word document, it could be in Excel spreadsheet. How well I achieve my goals and so forth. And the same goes for parties external in organizations such as customers. And I think the type of data that you're actually porting will probably, to some extent, determine the structure. If someone asks for the entire set of web browsing records, it's going to look quite different how you do that compared to if they say, well, can you please give me all the transactions I've done with you over the last few years? So I think the format has to match a couple of things. It has to match the type of data you've been asked for, and also has to match what your organization thinks they're supporting. So you could just say very minimalist, here's the data, just dump it all out in, I don't know, in whatever, you deal with it, you understand it, which is complying to the law, but it's not necessarily friendly. Or you could put more effort and say, but this is the data we have, and try and explain it and so forth, and this is what this data means, and to try and stop people coming back and questioning you in terms of how do you use the data and so forth. So really, the format, I think, again, it depends. And the answer to many of these GDPR questions is it depends. And if you look at the LinkedIn groups, you ask a question like this, and there's 4 or 5 different answers, and all of them is it depends. And as people grow into the regulation and people understand the regulation better, I think it's going to become a lot clearer as to what is expected of organizations, and you might even see refinements of the regulation in years to come to be more specific about these questions. Okay, if there's no other questions, that's absolutely fine. Thank you all for listening today. And I'll give you a few minutes back of your time as the materials will be coming out. And my email address is on the slide if you've got any more questions.